About to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's go, let's be free with Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free.
By a whole grade.
I've improved.
Improved.
By a whole grade.
By a whole grade.
By a whole grade.
My teacher isn't just Mr. Maddock. It's a whole teaching team made up of James, Mike and Marta.
My classroom's all about doing and applying. My days standing at the front of the classroom with a PowerPoint are long gone.
I master every concept by learning at my own pace.
I spend 100% of my class time interacting and supporting individual students.
I move on only when the moment is right for me, not the whole class.
I know what each and every student is mastering and struggling on at every moment.
I know exactly what I need to learn next, and I can go back and review material at any time.
I spend my teaching time supporting and inspiring, not planning, delivering and marking.
I can learn from anywhere at any time.
I can switch off when school closes, knowing they are learning from the best.
My teacher has my homework marked before I get to class.
I set every piece of homework at the start of the year.
I'm 2 weeks ahead of my expected progress.
I can track everyone's progress with a swipe of a finger.
I can track my own progress and set my own targets.
I now have time to focus on developing the skills of every learner in my classroom.
I know exactly what it means to explain, evaluate and analyse, and I'm not afraid of any exam.
My lessons are now far more about the skills and the application, not just the content itself.
I've completely remodeled what it means to be a teacher in my classroom.
Good evening to all. Guten Abend zu alle. Bonsoir a tous. Buenas tardes a todos. Bona tarde a totum. That last one's a challenge for you. See if you know what language that last one was in. I'm out. That's me all languaged out. Good to see you. Thanks for being here. It's really appreciated. We have a really full session here, so I'm slightly. It's one of the ones where I'm slightly nervous we're going to go over time, but we're not. We will finish on time one way or another. But we have a lot to do, so you should have your notes pages, you youngsters out there. You should have your notes pages. You should have your practice questions that go with them. One of the things we're going to do towards the end of the session today is I'm going to set you a challenge to write an extended piece of writing as is set in those notes pages, and I'm going to give you the tools to write it, but you are going to write it. Okay, so that's going to be really interesting to see what we get out of that. Do please subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's super important. It's been going really well for us recently to get that subscribership up. It makes a massive difference to us. It's virtually nothing for you, but do subscribe. It makes a significant difference and keeps this free, so please do it. Thirdly, be aware that I'm going to be switching between microphones today. Look, I have this one. This one, which you can't hear yet because it's not switched on yet. So you need to potentially switch your levels and your volume between different parts of the show. So when we go from the canvas back to the camera and that sort of thing. So do be prepared for that. And let me remind you about 2 ways that you can interact. Marta, who is with us this evening. Marta, hi.
Hello, good evening.
How are my languages skills from the languages teaching expert over there?
Beautiful. Yeah, very good.
Well, that's nice. So, first of all, can you show these guys how they submit the interactive questions, please?
Of course I can. So all you guys need to do is go to the EverLearner.com. You go to click on news, and then here you have the interactive questions. Click on the interactive questions, and you've got here all the interactive questions you can participate on. And today's session
is number 7, I think. It's called Ethics and Deviance. I'm pretty sure it's A-level. Sociocultural. It'll be Sociocultural session 1, Marta.
Well, I can't find it.
A-level P, Sociocultural.
Oh, yeah.
Session 1. It's actually session 7.
Okay.
Yeah?
Oh, I see. Because I was looking for session 7, I couldn't see it.
I know, you've got confused. So in the total mass of things, it's session 7. But for Sociocultural, it's session 1. So
here it is.
So here it is. So guys, this is where we want you to go to submit your extended writing. As I said, I'll raise that challenge with you later on. Don't sort of pass that over. It's a great opportunity for you to get your answers to us, and we will feed back to you on your writing. Trust me, that is a really rich thing to do. So if you want to sharpen up in preparation for your exam, you should do that. Also, we'd like these guys to interact on the social media, and especially with people at home. They should be able to do this really well this evening. So Marta, could you show us that? We need to have the hashtag of revision break on Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. We will pick that up, and we guarantee to show you in the stream, assuming that it's obviously appropriate content. So if you can share that with us, that would be great, and we'll get you onto the stream. Also, if you could ask questions that way, of course, which might be more functional. So all that being said, have I forgotten anything, Marta, before we get into our monster session here?
No, I don't think so.
No? Happy? Okay, so I'm gonna get my microphone out of the way, and when you're ready, Marta, you can switch us over. So we are addressing ethics. And of course, when we talk about ethics, it's kind of normal that we talk also about deviance. So we're going to come to that point in a few moments' time, in the second half of this kind of chunk. But before then, I really want to get into a conversation about the notion of sportsmanship and gamesmanship. Before that, I want to remind you of an idea. And it's an idea of amateurism. And often when people hear the term amateurism, they think of, in sporting context, someone who does sport but doesn't get paid. But I kind of want you to switch your frequency to something slightly different about this notion. Amateurism is much more of what we call a traditional 19th century code. What, James? It's not just about not getting paid. No, it's a traditional identity born out of the sporting ethics of the developing middle class in the early to mid 19th century that is represented strongly through a notion of sport. So a little bit more detail on that is that it's very important to follow rules. We're going to talk about that in a few moments' time. Now, I don't think anyone would disagree with that point, but where does that lead us to in sort of a modern sporting context? It comes out of a notion of codification and codified sport with set rules, laws, and regulations, codified often by people from that middle-class group, so it reflects the identity of that group. It's also what we call structural fairness. Structural
structural fairness. Really nice term to get into your answers if you can. Structural fairness. And what we mean by that is sometimes we call that the contract to compete. Sometimes we call that notion of fair play, that everybody has the right to perform on a level playing field. Everybody has a right to equal access and opportunity because the codified and structured nature of the sport and the activity ensures that. It is also what we describe as sport with moral values. Now, we're going to talk about this a lot. Moral values. So sport with moral values, and we want to understand that notion that sport is just not something you do because you're trying to win or compete, but you're doing it for a moral underpinning structure. As I said before, it's a very middle class concept. Okay, so it's a very middle class concept. I'm not saying that's bad or that's good. That's just the reality of this tradition. And we also want to argue here that the amateur view is that the main emphasis, at least theoretically, is on taking part and not necessarily on winning. Finally, my final point is that amateurism is based on a notion of, put this in inverted commas, God-given abilities. Okay, so something like a very scientific approach to sport, God-given abilities. A very scientific approach to sports, to coaching, to biomechanics, to medicine would be quite outside of this amateur approach. It would be a much more scientific, professional, modern approach. So it's important to understand that notion of amateurism because it feeds into this notion of sportsmanship and gamesmanship. Now, today, how are we going to see this represented? Well, we see it represented today in things like fair play awards. Okay. Sometimes they're valued and sometimes they're not. We see it represented today in in the process of professionalization. Now, you might think, well, that's the opposite of professionalization. But if you look, for example, at rugby in the 90s, rugby in the 90s was an amateur code, and it is now developed into something which is different to this. It is a scientific, professional approach to developing best quality performance possible. So we have this as an indicator that this amateurism has been in evidence. So in that context, we now want to understand the distinctions and differences between a notion of sportsmanship or sportspersonship and a notion of gamesmanship or gamespersonship. From now on, I'm going to use the term sportsmanship and gamesmanship for sportspersonship and sportsmanship. Okay, so sportsmanship, first of all, key points. We are talking here about an activity or a sport which is playing by the written rules. Okay, so sportsmanship is depicted by playing by the written, codified rules. We know that. But we also depict sportsmanship as with a code of fairness. With a code of fairness. A code of fairness. And that's a nice distinction to make, because of course in a moment when we talk about gamesmanship, we're going to perhaps be losing that notion. We're also talking about a notion of sportsmanship as maintaining fairness. Maintaining fairness. Now that fairness could be that everyone has an equal opportunity and access. That fairness could be that everyone's treated the same. That fairness could be that the rules create a level playing field, something along the lines of weight classes, for example, age divisions. These ensure that by structural fairness, we have fairness coming through in the experience of participating in sport. Sportsmanship often has at the heart etiquette. Okay, interesting word to spell. 3 T's in there. There's number 1, there's number 2, there's number 3. Etiquette. And what we mean by etiquette is this notion of code of ethics, the unwritten rules, the conventions that a sport incorporates, cheering the opposition, congratulating an opponent player when you lose and they win. Etiquette could be things such as encouraging supportive comments, encouraging supportive commentary. Etiquette could be, for example, when you're playing rugby or football and the ball's gone out of play, you offer your hand to pull your opponent from the ground, for example. These would be good examples of etiquette-based behaviour. But we also want to say about sportsmanship, that this is declining. It's declining in the modern era. And you may want to quickly have a scan down at the question we're going to have a look at in a moment about why that decline might have happened. And is that because winning is becoming the most important thing? Is that to do with commercialization? Is that to do with a profit-driven motive? Okay, are those things declining this traditional approach? And we can kind of understand that better if we look at a notion of gamesmanship. Now, one of the descriptions I really like with gamesmanship, have a look at this. And winning by cunning means. Winning by cunning means. So finding a loophole, finding a hack, finding a way to use the rules to your advantage. Now, importantly, gamesmanship is within the rules. So we're not talking about cheating. We're not talking about breaking the rules. It's within the rules. But we describe it as stretching or bending the rules. Okay, we could also talk about, let's give some examples of this. We would have things such as delaying. Okay, so that would be a good example. We would have things such as time wasting. Now, you've got to check within the particular game whether this is, often this is outlawed, but people kind of get away with it. We would be talking about things such as sledging, using kind of clever or, well, sometimes clever, sometimes not, clever comments to the opposition to kind of put them off. This could involve things like psyching out. A bit of a staring match might be a good example. We might be talking about sort of clever use of things like injury timeouts, getting your team a rest by needing treatment on court, for example, or on the pitch. Things like that would be interesting. We've even got things such as, in the modern era, things like inappropriate use in things like toilet breaks in tennis, say, where a player will wander off for a bit because they need to sort of change focus or they need to do something. They'll use that notion of toilet break. And these would be some really, really nice examples of gamesmanship. Okay, so we've got sportsmanship and gamesmanship, and the thing you need to realize there is that they are not completely different. There is probably a moral and ethical difference between the two, but they are similar. They are both within the rules, for example. But gamesmanship has become more common. Why? We've got this notion of increased commercialization, so the greater value of winning. We've got winning, or the win ethic becoming the win at all costs ethic. Let me write that up there. Have we moved towards a win at all costs ethic? Which, by the way, can take us well beyond gamesmanship, which we'll look at in a second. And where I'd like to take us next with this is I'd like to look at the notion of deviancy. Now, let me be clear. Deviancy is absolutely not cheating. Deviancy is absolutely not gamesmanship. Okay, so let me define deviancy for you first of all. We are talking about deviancy, which is something which is differing from the norms of society. Okay, so something which is differing from the norms of society. That's our definition of deviancy, and I bring your attention to these terms in particular that are going to be important when you describe that thing. Now, I also want to introduce you to a notion, well, really three types of deviancy. I'll come to the third one in a moment. The first one is what we call negative deviancy, and often with deviancy, this is the one we tend to look at. So let me give you some examples of what we mean by this. By the way, this is what we call a Bell distribution curve, and Bell distribution is a very interesting concept because some of you will have studied it, I'm sure. Bell distribution is very interesting because it can often detail and display or illustrate the overall behaviours of a large population of people, and we often find that behavioural tendencies in populations end up in this bell curve distribution. Okay, and you see why it's a bell curve, because it looks like a bell. And what we're describing with a negative deviancy, we are talking about notions, let me just do something a bit lighter than that. We are talking about notions such as negative deviancy over on the left. We are talking about notions such as performance enhancing drugs. We are talking about notions such as violence in sport, things that really are ethically condemnable. We are talking about cheating. Those of you on the pulse can think about Australian cricketers tampering with cricket balls, for example, if you like. We could also be talking about things like betting scandals, whether that's a sports person betting on or against themselves, or it could be providing information to others for betting, and we've also got notions of match fixing. Now, notice on our distribution curve that relatively few people undertake those behaviours in comparison to the norms. Norms would be things like trying hard, playing within the rules, attending training, doing warm-ups, that kind of stuff. So we're going to get relatively few in comparison to that number, but we've still got a group of people who would be willing to do this. Now, the other thing I'd say is the more negative things get, we're down to this kind of area here, like real nasty substance abuse, think Lance Armstrong is a good case for that. We're talking about right down here, quite rare, and in his case very, very high profile. But we also need to understand what this group are doing over here. This is what we call positive deviancy. Well, that's a good thing, isn't it, if people are doing things positively? Well, with positive, we've got a different notion. With positive, we are talking about notions of over-applying the norms of society, such as working hard. So what does that lead to? It leads to things like overtraining. Okay, overtraining is a positive deviancy characteristic. We could also lead to things such as overconformity. Okay, overconformity would be like accepting the view of dominant people in the group. So overconformity would just be going along with the crowd, for example. The culture of cycling is rampant drug use, so you conform to that set of behaviours, which of course would lead you down into the negative deviancy setting as well. We're also talking about positive deviancy, but such as being personal sacrifice. For example, becoming so dedicated to your sport that you lose your family, that your husband, your wife leave you, never see your children anymore. This sort of thing would be personal sacrifice. Again, get it clear in your own mind how you see that. And then, of course, what we've got here is we've got the notion of overuse injuries. And, of course, that comes from overtraining, or can also come from a lack of variety in training, of course, or poor technique. But in this case, it's coming from overtraining. Overuse injuries such as stress fractures would be classic examples of what we call positive deviancy. And both of those are to be, of course, avoided, and coaches and trainers need to work with people to ensure that they don't go down that role of that route of deviancy. Now, let us do some questions. Now, I've taken these questions bit by bit. I'm only going to demonstrate questions in this first half of the session. When we do the second half of the session later on, I'm actually going to get you guys in the entirety to the question. I'm just going to give you a structure. I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys write. Now, on this one, however, we've got a question. Notice here, as I said before, this is not necessary for OCR. So using examples, explain why. Okay, so explain why. So explain why leads me to because. Explain why leads me to language such as therefore, comma. It could lead me to this means. Okay, that sort of language is explaining why. Explain why gamesmanship has become a common feature of contemporary sport. For anyone who's unsure, contemporary means kind of like modern. Okay, so let's have a look at this. First of all, note what I do in the outset. Gamesmanship is the stretching of the rules to gain an advantage. Now, we're going to get a mark here, I think, the stretching of the rules. What am I doing with green? We're going to get a mark here, I think, but notice I'm not explaining yet, but I'm going to get a mark. What have I done there? I've taken my term and I've defined it. Okay, define my terms. Now, okay, the question isn't specifically asking me that, but I've got 6 marks and it's not told me what gamesmanship is, so I'm going to tell it what gamesmanship is. So I get my mark in there because I'm clarifying the terms. Second bit, this is more common because I don't need an introduction. I don't need to go into some beautiful structure of like working my way to the answer. No, I'm answering. This is more common because. Okay, there's my language from over there. I'm explaining why. Why is it? Because. Why is it? Because. This is more common because, and here's some of my answer. Because of the growth of the win at all costs ethic, so growth of win at all costs, the increased importance of winning, and the growth in commercialism. Nice marks. I've given some reasons why. This is explaining why it's become games have become more common. Let's keep going. Therefore, comma, don't forget that little bad boy in there. Therefore, comma, the traditional ethos of sportsmanship has been diluted. I was really happy with my word diluted here. So sportsmanship has not been lost. It's just not as clear anymore. It's just not as common. It's just not as consistent. So it's been diluted today. Now, you could choose whatever word you used, but I'm trying to get that idea across. So traditional ethos of sportsmanship has been diluted. Next point. Instead, comma, we have a professional approach. Okay, so I might get my mark there, where the rules are to be taken advantage of. And the only commodities of value, I've got my max, I believe. The only commodities of value are profit and winning. And I've got some extra detail there, should I have needed them. Go back to the question, did I explain why gamesmanship has become a common feature today? Yes, I said these are the factors, and I've said why sportsmanship has been lost. Now, I perhaps could have got a mark for defining sportsmanship as well, but let's move on. Again, with reference to the sport of tennis, compare. Now, compare questions must be met with comparative statements. Compare gamesmanship and deviancy. So let's go through this slowly, okay? Compare gamesmanship and deviancy. So let's go first of all. Gamesmanship is within the rules, comma space, whereas deviancy is against the rules. Look, within the rules, against the rules. Now, would I get 1 mark or 2 for that comparison? You can never be sure in this situation. Let's be super harsh on ourselves and give ourselves just 1 for that comparative statement. Perhaps we'd get 2 for that. Now then, here's my question to you. What is the weakness with that comparative statement? Have a look at it. There's something wrong with it in relation to the question. What is it? And it's this guy here, Tom. I haven't made reference to tennis. If you're asked to give examples, you must give examples, okay? I don't know if you'd need to give it in every single comparison, but you should get it in there. Gamesmanship is morally dubious. Okay, so I've got morally dubious for gamesmanship. Similarly, deviancy is immoral, such as a tennis player taking steroids. Now I've got my example in there. Okay, let's keep going. Making comparative statements. Look in this one. By the way, comparisons, you do get similarities and differences. That's important. So look, similarly, comma, so we've got morally dubious. Similarly, deviancy is immoral. So that's a similarity. Not the same, but similar. Gamesmanship is just within the norms of society. However, comma, deviancy, such as verbally abusing your tennis opponent, is outside the norms. I keep going. I'm being harsh on myself here. Gamesmanship is the win ethic. So gamesmanship is like a win ethic, professional approach, doing what you need to do. Comma space, whereas deviancy is the win at all costs ethic. 4 marks. Let's keep going. No tennis example there, of course. Gamesmanship leads to assertion and sometimes aggression. Okay, so we might get this sort of assertive, aggressive behavior. However, comma, deviancy leads to violence and drug use, cheating, things like that. Now, I didn't get my max. Okay, I've been super harsh. I didn't get my max. Now, I think in the actual exam, I'm probably going to get way more. Potentially, I've got way more than 6 points there. But can you see my point about comparative statements? If you've been asked to compare, you must compare. And if you're not using language such as comma space, whereas, however, comma, similarly, comma at the start of a sentence. What else have I got? What else did I use in here? I've got those are the ones I used. If I'm not using that similarly, comma, if I'm not using however, comma, if I'm not using comma space, whereas, I'm probably not comparing, and I must compare.
So, good stuff. Bit of a session there. Yeah, plenty to think about, I think. So, excuse me if I stumbled over a few bits and bobs there, if it's the time of day. Marta, any questions from you?
From me, yeah, we haven't got any questions yet from any of our viewers, so I would really encourage them to go for it.
Mm-hmm.
But from me, more than a question, I'm after your opinion, really. I would like to know what's your opinion on the current move in sport towards more commercialization, gamesmanship, less amateurism.
Okay, so first things first, for you guys studying the A-level, it's super important that you do incorporate opinions into your answers and particularly potentially into your conclusions to your answers. I think that's really a strength of a high quality extended piece of writing, especially in this topic area. So if I was to give my personal opinion on the growth of commercialization in the modern sporting era, I would say that I consider it to be inevitable. I'd consider it to be inevitable. And why do I say that? I would say it was inevitable because it represents the lurch towards a capitalistic economic structure that has happened over recent decades. So in that sense, I think it's inevitable. Do I like that? I like aspects of it. I think certain quality of sport has improved. Access to different experience of sport, different athletes, different performances from around the world has improved. The growth in media, for example, has improved and increased, and that I think helps both the participant, the performer, and the audience member. However, I do feel we have lost our way. Excuse me. I do feel we've lost our way a little bit, and we've managed to lose a traditional identity that was valuable not because it's historic and traditional, but it was valuable because it was intrinsically valuable. And my point on that would be exactly that word, intrinsic, that movement, activity, sport, competition, elite performance, these things can be intrinsically valuable to many, 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 many people. And I think what we're doing at the moment is we're overemphasizing winning at the top of that pyramid, and we're underemphasizing participation as the base of that pyramid. And don't forget that there is, of course, a relationship between the two. The stronger, the broader, and the thicker of the base, the more likely we are to have high levels of really top quality elite participation, elite performance as well. So for me, that would be a loss in my opinion, but I accept that many people don't see it that way. Many people want rules to change. Many people want there to be development and modernization. And I guess it's a normal process. I just feel that the motive behind it, which is commercialization and profiting, shifts what I understand sport to be closer to something like sports entertainment. And sports entertainment is something that personally I don't value as highly as I value sport. So therefore, for me, overall, it's a negative. That was a long answer, wasn't it?
Yeah, but a good one. And I actually have another question.
Go on.
This is a question. Comes from Mike.
Okay.
Mike wants to know what decides what is considered cheating in one sport, but might not be cheating in another sport.
Okay.
Like, for example, I don't know, throwing a punch will not be...
I think what Mike has cottoned onto there is the fact that I forgot, especially for you WJC learners out there, I forgot to talk about the concept of relative deviancy.
Oh, no.
And I've just realised that I didn't actually forget to talk about it in the bit I just did. I just forgot to turn the paper over and look at the back. So it's very good that you reminded me. Relative deviancy suggests why or how it can be in one particular sport or one particular activity, the same behavior can be deviant, whereas in another it's completely functional assertive behavior. So let's take the examples of MMA, mixed martial arts, and let's take the example of, let's choose badminton, for, just to choose another sport. So obviously a wheel kick in mixed martial arts is completely ethical behavior and would simply be considered assertive. From a psychological studies perspective, we wouldn't even call it aggression. Okay, we call it assertion. It's within the rules. The intent is the successful execution of the skill. in badminton, if you wheel kick someone, I don't know why it's funny in badminton. It's more funny in badminton. If you wheel kick someone, I think you guys know what's going to happen. You are never ever going to be able to play that sport again because it would consider to be the height of deviance, and we call that concept relative deviancy. Now that is a specified concept on the WJC A-level exam board, but it will be useful for all of you to incorporate into your answers. Oh, we have a photo. Tell me.
Brilliant. Yeah, and we've got some participation. We've received our first photo of the day.
Hey, look at that.
It comes from Robert Setman, and let me put it on the screen. Here we go. So Robert's taken absolutely fantastic,
Can you show me the picture as well?
beautiful.
Oh yeah, look at that
notes,
handsome guy on the tablet in the background.
Lovely pens as well.
Well, Marta, those pens are big in our lives, aren't they?
Oh yeah, we've got some here.
Yeah, I mean, what was the young person's name? Sorry.
Robert Stedman.
If you put me back on screen, saying, Robert, you are a gentleman, sir. Thank you for sharing your image. I mean, these are the pens in our office. We have 2 batch pens. In case you think I only make coloured stuff in like an electronic form, they're my pens for making notes and things and writing answers. And Martha's really big into these pens, so we share that love for you. So share that love with you. Sorry, I should say. So. Thank you, Rob. We really appreciate that. Other photos will be shown in the stream. Now, Marta, we've got a huge chunk left to do, so I'm just conscious of time. I really don't want to keep these guys after a 7 o'clock deadline. So when you're ready, I'm ready to move on. Yeah. Okay, great.
Okay, specifically deviance or deviancy. By the way, you can use either the term deviance or the term deviancy. They are synonymous terms. So we want to look specifically at performance-enhancing drugs, okay? So I've made a note here for us to have a little look at types of performance-enhancing drugs. So I want to kind of jump to some big categories. Don't consider this list to be in any way exhaustive, okay? I'm going to be touching on some of these as we go through. First of all, I want to consider what we'd call peptide hormones. Now, it seems like a fairly grand term, but I want to introduce you to 2 factors or 2 areas of this. The first one is EPO. EPO, or erythropoietin, and human growth hormone, HGH. Now, human growth hormone in many ways kind of does what it says on the tin, and I'm not going to go too far down that rabbit hole. If you want to have a look at work on HGH, go and have a look at the EverLearner.com and look at our full playlist on that. On EPO, I think this one deserves a little more attention in this particular case because it is a particularly powerful substance for aerobic athletes and for particularly the development of red blood cells. Now, if you consider that the growth of red blood cell, the process called erythropoiesis, and we're talking about here erythropoietin, this is a hormone which we all produce naturally, which stimulates the production of red blood cells. Okay, so you can start to realize how that would be so effective for something like an endurance athlete. Think Lance Armstrong, think road cyclists. Think about those sorts of performers are very likely to have a temptation to use something like EPO. I also want to talk to you briefly about anabolic steroids. Okay, anabolic steroids. Anabolic steroids are probably the granddaddy of performance-enhancing drugs, widely used by North American teams and Eastern European teams through the 70s, 80s and 90s, and have persisted in their use. So a couple of things about anabolic steroids. We are particularly talking about lean muscle growth. Okay, lean muscle growth. And we are particularly talking about this in the context of this being a training drug. Okay, now EPO in many ways is a performance drug, whereas anabolic steroids are a training drug. They allow the intensity of training to be higher and the recovery times to be shorter, this training drug of anabolic steroids. And they're based on the basic principles of testosterone. Okay, and testosterone, coming back to this point, produces lean muscle growth. So, of course, we have countless examples of athletes who have been found guilty of use of anabolic steroids. A particularly modern one would be someone like Justin Gatlin, for example. But you can have a little look, and there've been literally hundreds. Other drugs that I think it's useful just for us to have a grasp of. I want to talk to you about diuretics. Diuretics are a flushing drug. And they cause urination. Now you might think, hang on, why is that useful? So what we mean by this is that if someone, for example, has been taking nandrolone, say, and and they use a diuretic, it's going to help to flush the evidence of that anabolic steroid out of the system. The other thing is that urination can help people lose fluid quickly, and therefore they can make weight in MMA or horse racing or something like that. And finally, I wanted to mention the use of stimulants. Okay, stimulants, and I'm going to give you one example of stimulants, and I'm picking this one particularly because it's not illegal, and an example would be something like caffeine. Okay, caffeine, which used to be legal above a certain level, is now completely accepted as a performance enhancing, how would you call it, supplement is the word I'm looking for. And caffeine, for example, it up arrow increases alertness, so it's really nice for games players, for example. And it increases fat metabolism. So it gets fat to the muscle faster and more efficiently. So these kinds of performance enhancing drugs are really important. But the one I kind of want to leave you with is this one. And it's the notion of blood doping. Now, I'm not going to get into gene doping. I'm not going to get into narcotic analgesics. I'm not going to get into a couple of other areas as well. Do your research on those, please. It's worthwhile. But blood doping, and particularly the use of transfusions, is become particularly common until recently. And the main reason for that was that they found a way of testing EPO. So EPO, by the way, is often considered a form of blood doping. But transfusions, where we take, we, as if I've ever done it, but where an athlete would remove up to, by the way, it can be a massive amount of blood. Sometimes between 1 and 2 litres is common. Think that through for a second. They would remove that much blood, and what they would then do is they'd spin it in a centrifuge. Centrifuge is like a spinning machine, and what happens in that centrifuge is all the heavy elements of the blood settle at the bottom of the tube, and that's the red blood cell, and then they retransfuse all of the other stuff, the plasma, the white blood cells, the platelets, all go back in immediately, and then they've cold stored the red blood cell. Sometime late, often like 6 weeks later, they'll retransfuse that red blood cell back into the person's body, mixed in a saline solution. And of course, in that situation, the individual has regrown the red blood cell, and they end up with a greater, what we call hematocrit. So it's a nice term for you to use. That it's really good for an increasing hematocrit, and that is the percentage of the blood which is red blood cell, which of course is the oxygen and CO2 for that matter carrying capacity. Now, what I want to do beyond that is I want to look at the for and against of drug taking. So we're going to make an assumption here that you know the differences between illegal and illegal, legal and illegal substances. Let's say creatine legal, anabolic steroid illegal, for example. And what we're going to do here is we're going to look at the ethical argument. So people that argue that drugs should be allowed in sport argue the following: that it levels the playing field. Think that through for a second. That has fairly dramatic implications. That suggests that numerous athletes currently are using these drugs without being caught. And the question therefore is asked by lots of athletes is, did I lose fairly? If someone finished, 4th in the Olympics, for argument's sake, or 6th, did I lose to athletes that were clean? Well, allowing drugs would perhaps remedy that condition. By the way, don't think I'm personally arguing for allowing drugs to be legal in sport. I'm just giving you the arguments. Other factors are that making drugs legal leads to a control of substances. So rather than an athlete having to get anabolic steroid from some back door, some back door of a gym, that substance can be much higher quality, and that can lead to less threat to things such as health. Okay, things such as health, it's worth considering about. The other point is that develops a market, so that has an economic advantage. Okay, so that trade could have an economic advantage. Think it through whether you think that has any relevance or not. We would certainly get an up arrow greater spectacular sport. So sport would become more powerful, more dramatic, bigger hits, bigger smashes, more resistance, fewer injuries. Well, I don't know about fewer injuries. You get people who recovered faster from injury, for example. Other points about drugs are that drugs and ped use reflect society. So basically, there's a large proportion of our modern society which is, to some degree, using or even dependent on alcohol, nicotine, painkillers, antidepressants, and even in many cases antipsychotic drugs. So you can start to see how sport reflects that general picture. And the other point is that within sport today, we absolutely have what we call a win culture. The commodity of value, as I mentioned earlier, in sport today is winning. At least in our culture, it's dramatically greater than perhaps it was before. And therefore, it is an inevitability that these drugs are going to become more and more relied upon. Now, I just want to quickly address, why would an athlete take a performance-enhancing drug? And these are some of the reasons. Pressure. They might feel pressured into it, either because they think others are doing it, or even directly a coach pressures them, for example. They do it because it increases their chances of winning, to win. They do it to equalize. If everyone else is, the cycling in the 90s, classic example, they do it because there's a culture of it. And they do it perhaps because there's a lack of education against it. So those are some of the reasons why an athlete might choose it while it's illegal. Okay, but that, it's kind of a different model. Now, against the argument, or the argument against permitting drugs, is that we consider it to be cheating. It would be very difficult to move away from that model. Secondly, we still maintain, as we discussed before, a notion and an importance of sportsmanship. Well, this is clearly not sportsmanship. We'd also have, as we seem to have allowed in other areas, a loss of traditional values. So if we permit performance-enhancing drugs to be used in sport, that traditional value is going to be really lost for good, and perhaps even forever. More of which in a second. This development is going to be uneven. We're going to have what we'd call, that's meant to be a H by the way, a tech arms race around drugs. The wealthiest nations with the biggest investment programs are going to produce the best designer drugs, and they are going to win more frequently. And that, of course, is going to become a competitive industry, in other words, and therefore there's going to be more developmental. We're also going to have the notion of health risks. Remember that athletes do not take small amounts of EPO. They do not take small amounts of anabolic steroid. They take gigantic amounts of these substances because that's what's going to get them closer to winning. The other point against this idea is that there's no return. Once we permit drugs as being legal in sport, there probably is no way back. So once we go down that path, it's done. We're down that path forever. Now, you could argue we're already down that path because athletes are doing it anyway, but that's the reality. Now, we could also describe sport might become, and again, I use this word very cautiously, I don't really like using it, but we'd get sort of a notion of freakish performance, unhuman levels of performance, literally. Okay, so that is an argument against, but don't forget that we've got this more spectacular point over here as a positive. We'd also find that permitting drugs would shift the problem. It shifts the problem. Okay, because of course the problem here is we've got a win at all costs ethic. I should have put that up here actually. Win at all costs ethic. To win. It's a win at all costs ethic. So it shifts the problem simply from being, should athletes be able to use anabolic steroid, for example? Well, it's just going to shift the line to what people can and can't use further down that kind of performance enhancing drug route. Should is the next argument, should we allow genetic modification of an individual to get better athletic performance? Okay, that's where the line might become if we did this. So that leads me to this next point. Where does it stop? Where does it stop? Because this is just opening the old Pandora's box, of course, and we create what I think most of us would argue as negative role models. And of course, these are some fairly dramatic problems. Now, we're running out of time here, so I really need to move on. I want to talk about WADA briefly. Now, WADA is a really fascinating organisation, in my opinion, for numerous reasons. I want to kind of get to some key aspects of this. First of all, I want you to know that with WADA, it is 50% funded by the IOC. So think about WADA as the international body which has responsibility for all national anti-doping agencies to get their protocols right. So it's an international body, but it's funded by the International Olympic Committee, at least by 50%. So of course WADA, it's very difficult for them to do anything that would hurt the IOC, which perhaps explains why Russia in recent years has only reluctantly and recently been banned from Olympic Games, for example, even though their infrastructural drug abuse was absolutely proven. Look at the story of Grigory Rodchenko if you're interested in that. I'm not going to get into it now. Now, I also want to talk about the roles of this organisation. So they make the banned substance list. Okay, so WADA makes the banned substance list. So that's really important that we know that. We also need to know that WADA funds research. Okay, so WADA is the body which is sort of hoped would stay ahead of the cheats, as it were. Okay, so that's what they do too. And they also delegate. Okay, they also delegate. Now, delegate means they pass on responsibility. Well, who do they pass on responsibility to? To national ADAs. And a national ADA would be something like UCAD, UK Anti-Doping, or ASADA or USADA in America. These sorts of organisations take the guidance provided by WADA and they act upon it within the home nation. And they also develop what's called the testing methodology. Okay, and I'm going to talk just a little bit about that briefly because we're running out of time really. We've got a testing methodology. So 2 things on testing. We've got the in competition that WADA is responsible for, at least it gets the ADAs in the countries to do it, and it's got out of competition. Now, a couple of other quick details, out of competition, a couple of other quick things I want you to know. I'll do this one in a nice bright yellow. We have WADA implements a urine sample. So a couple of things about that urine sample. First of all, it's witnessed. Second, so someone literally watches you do a wee. Secondly, we have an A plus a B sample, A plus B sample, so that if the A sample returns a positive, the B sample can verify the positive. Now that works really well because theoretically the bottles cannot be opened without cracking the glass. But there's a bit of a problem with that because Russia found a way. So anyway, I'll let you look into that in your own time if you want a bit more information on that particular case. And thirdly, the testing is random for that urine sample. Now, for the other area of testing, I want to introduce you to the notion of the biological passport. Now, this is a relatively modern development, biological passport. So this is where blood and urine levels are monitored over time. Blood and urine levels. So, for example, if someone's hematocrit seems to be at 45% and then it spikes up to 60% out of nowhere, that's going to indicate that something odd is going on. So it's all about detecting changes. So it detects changes, and we could say over time for that one. And it's really good for peptide hormones. Okay, it's really good for peptide hormones. What do we mean by that? EPO and HGH can be detected because you see a spike, and that's really important. Okay, it's also good for blood doping because, for example, a spike in hematocrit or red blood cell level is going to be blood doping, so it's really effective for those things. So WADA, as you see there, is a really super important agency to try and get these methods correct. So I'm not going to go on about sort of other aspects of WADA, but just be aware. They do a lot of campaign work. They've also got sort of advanced testing methodologies. They work in combination with other bodies to ban countries such as Russia, for example. They apply the rules consistently to different nations, and they make a very consistent set of rules. Now, what I want to get to, because we're really short of time, is this answer. Now, right from the start, I've not wanted to give you this, and I haven't wanted to give this answer to you as a model answer. But let's just have a look at it together, because I want you guys to complete this for me. Athletes of all kinds face the temptation of using PEDs to increase their chance of winning. We agree. Discuss the possible impacts of Kate, she's a triathlete, taking performance-enhancing drugs. So what would be the impact for her if she took performance-enhancing drugs? Now, we've been asked to discuss, and as I've said to you on a few other occasions, discuss can mean a couple of different things. Discuss basically means give the main details, talk about the main details. And often with discuss, we want to do one of the following. We want to evaluate, which is, giving us advantages and disadvantages. We want to analyze, which is breaking the answer down and explaining it. We want to compare, and sometimes we want to explain. Okay, so one of the things we need to do when we get a discuss question is try and identify which of these it would be. And for me, the one that jumps out from this question is because it's asked me for the possible impacts. Those possible impacts could be positive and they definitely will, at least be some of them, negative. So for me, that jumps out as an evaluate question. So as a result of that, I'm going to expect certain language to be used in here. So if I'm looking at an evaluate question, I'm going to expect to read in an answer things like on the one hand, and then some content. I'm going to expect to read on the other hand. And, you know, it could be on the one hand, Kate might take EPO and dramatically increase her aerobic performance, being able to maintain higher intensities for longer. On the other hand, you know, she may develop bradycardic conditions which threatens her health. You know, we're talking about those kinds of things. We'd also say there an advantage. So this is going to be a classic. So of course, we're going to expect language such as a disadvantage. Okay, can you see how we might start to structure this answer? A reason to, so a reason to take drugs, you know, could be she feels she wants to level the playing field. A reason not to, and then we might talk about, you know, the implications of the WADA testing and the biological passport. Reason not to, she's going to get caught. One implication is, so there's an implication of this behaviour. One implication is, and then she gives the implication, she might get caught through the testing protocol. Another implication is, this one could be positive, for example. You know, she would turn into a better athlete, at least temporarily. We also want to see things such as, however, comma, this is where you give the other side of the argument afterwards. And we'd also expect to see, comma space, whereas, you know, the other side of this. But we would definitely expect to see, in conclusion, comma, if we're giving an value, if we're discussing something, we have to finish with a conclusion. Now, that gives us, in many ways, the shape of what our answer is going to look like. We're going to talk about the positive and the negative impacts on Kate, and we're going to do so using that kind of language. The content we could probably have a really good go at this point. Now, the other point I wanted to make to you is that we'd have sort of focal areas. Okay? So in the focal areas, we're now moving into a sort of a notion of analysing, breaking something down. I might do a section which is all about health, or health/performance. Okay, performance would increase, but health wouldn't, for example. We might have a part of our answer which is that drug taking can lead to an increased chance of winning. On the other hand, if other athletes are doing this as well, it develops into kind of a tech arms race. We also might want to talk about the implications for her career. Okay, it might have initial benefits, but what about long term? We might want to break this down and talk about her reputation. She might become a real star temporarily while her performances increase and get better, but the fall as she gets outed and caught for what she's done is going to be disastrous on her reputation. We might even want to talk about the law and the ethics of this, the law and the ethics of this. So if we were to break down, let's say that we ended up with 5 paragraphs that contained statements that had content in them of that kind with a great conclusion at the end, we would be very, very close to a really high quality answer. And this is my challenge to you. Can you guys now, as we showed you earlier on, can you get your answer in on this question? Now, a word of warning, if you're the OCR student here, okay, you guys would obviously be looking at your synoptic type response here. So just be aware of that. You may actually be combining this with other areas of the course. Here it's just been asked as one single area. Nevertheless, I think that gives us a great start point. You know, all we need to know is have good quality content in these areas, okay, and using this kind of language, and we would make a fabulous, interesting discussion. So I'm looking forward to reading yours. Okay, we'll be straight back.
Woof! Just bruised someone's ears by saying that. Never mind. Yeah, so there we are. Some stuff on drugs. Kind of controversial a little bit, right? I mean, it feels a little bit like we're touching on some stuff that you can't really argue for. But in some ways, I think that summarizes one of the skills of being a sociocultural student at advanced level. You need, or at least in our subject, you need to be able to address both sides of an argument, even if the case seems really, really clear cut. You need to be able to address both sides. So that looking at that argument for why performance enhancing drugs should be permitted is actually quite an interesting process to go down. Please don't read into any of that I think that's what should happen. I'm merely trying to equip you to write your answers. And also the challenge that I've set there for the extended writing, I'm really interested to see what you guys sent to us. Do put your answers in. That structure I've just provided, I mean, it's not really a structure, is it? It's just a set of tools that you could now go about writing a response to that question. I'm super interested to see what people actually do. Marta, your microphone's anything from you?
No, I personally haven't got any questions, no.
Have I not inspired you to some kind of insight or intrigue, Marta? Is there nothing?
No, I mean, I chuckled a bit when you said that some sort of inspector would watch you having a wee. We would watch an athlete while...
Didn't matter in Sochi.
Sorry?
Didn't matter in Sochi.
No.
The Russians found another way. I can't recommend the documentary Icarus enough to both colleagues and to students who are interested in this topic area. It's a really fascinating thing. The story of Grigory Rodchenko is, I think, symbolic. It's terrifying, yeah, but it's also symbolic of the endemic and systemic use of performance-enhancing drugs in this case, a range of sports, because it was kind of in Olympic and Paralympic sport, but it could also be very, very illustrative of the case in road cycling, for example. We have a history in sport of doping being used systematically to emphasize the role of nations, to be that shop window effect, that nation building, to represent the kind of the success of whether it's a political or an economic system like communism or capitalism. Don't think for a second that US athletes have not very widely used performance-enhancing drugs. Go back to the 80s in American athletics, for example. I mean, it was rife. So there was literally kind of an arms race for drugs. Now, I think WADA are doing a solid job to try and address that. My question about WADA is that ultimately their funding and what would essentially be their political affiliation to the IOC. In my opinion, WADA has to be independent. Mm-hmm. But that's just my personal opinion. Someone, and I'm not saying I'm the most read on this, it's just something that I would raise.
Mike also has a question about WADA. He's asking that since it's partly funded by the IOC,
yeah.
Does that mean that they focus more on Olympic athletes rather than non-Olympic athletes?
Theoretically, no. So basically the way that works, so if you think of it like almost like a tree structure, so national governing bodies, let's say the Football Association for argument's sake, or England Netball, they affiliate to the systems that are put in place by, in our country, UCAD, UKAD, UK Anti-Doping, or it could be, in RUSADA in Russia, or USADA in America, or name whichever one you want. And within that, then UCAD has to affiliate to the system which is placed down by WADA, and on that basis, all sport comes under that context, assuming they follow the rules of the National Anti-Doping Agency. So no, it shouldn't really matter. I guess you've almost got the contrary effect. Russia should, in my opinion, have been thoroughly banned for now at least 2 to 3 cycles of Olympics and Paralympics, and Winter Olympics and Paralympic Games. But that has only recently come into effect. And the reason I think most people argue that to be the case is because the IOC would have been severely undermined, and it has been severely undermined, without Russia involved. And what WADA ultimately did was they passed the decision on to the sport level international governing body, so to people like Seb Coe, who's responsible for athletics around the world, for example. And some of them banned Russia and some of them didn't, and that felt like a really weak act. And look, I'm going to go further. I think the fact that Russia competed in the Rio Games, there were some athletes who didn't, but in my opinion, the fact that Russia competed in the Olympic Games brought the whole idea of the Olympic Games into question. I don't want to say something too dramatic, but in my opinion, you have to ask a fundamental question about what is sport if we know for certain that there's been systemic cheating that's taken place, and that the actions taken did not expel the people who were guilty of those actions at a state level. And don't misunderstand me, I'm not suggesting this is just Russia. I guarantee you it is not. But that is certainly probably the clearest and the most stark case in recent years. So yeah, it's really concerning. I don't think I have the answer to it, but I do think WADA being completely autonomous would be a good start. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, so that's that.
Yeah, that's that.
So, guys, don't forget to subscribe. Please, 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 please do subscribe. It is really, really important for us. We need you to do that. It allows us to keep doing this. Make sure you're with us. We have a GCSE PE session tomorrow and Thursday, both at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. We have GCSE Spanish tomorrow at 4. I'm going to go and look at what we're doing on Wednesday. Commercialization or commercialism and the media on Wednesday in PE. For the A level, that is on at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Always available on demand afterwards. Do try and support us live. But yeah.
And Robert, get in touch.
Robert, I'm so sorry, Robert. You're probably waiting for me to say this. Robert, could you drop us an email at socialmedia@theeverlearner.com, please, sir? We would like to send you a gift. So we're just going to ask for your postal address. As always, we will be writing to you, visible to another adult, either in our team or possibly even copied into your teacher or something like that. But do get in touch. Socialmedia@theeverlearner.com. Robert, you are a gentleman. Thank you for being part of the show. For everyone else, have a good evening. If you're watching this on demand, have a good whatever you're doing, middle of the night, if it's the middle of the night. And we wish you all the best. We'll see you live tomorrow. Cheers, guys.